There is a certain weight that settles over a nation when it begins to fracture. Not the sudden crack of breaking stone, but something slower, something quieter. The long, grinding tension of a people who once called themselves one and can no longer agree on what that word means. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States of America was not a nation at peace. It was a republic built on contradictions, a country that spoke endlessly of liberty and equality, while millions of men, women, and children were bought and sold, chained to a system older than the nation itself. The tension had been building for decades. In the halls of Congress, voices grew sharper and the debates longer. In the fields of the South, the soil was soaked in unspoken suffering. And across the vast western prairies, a single question hung in the cold air, like smoke that would not clear. Would this land extend its chains, or finally break them? Into this fractured and fractious world stepped a man of extraordinary, unlikely origin, a man born in a dirt-floor log cabin in the wilderness of Kentucky, a man with no formal schooling to speak of, who knew the weight of an axe long before he ever knew the weight of a law book. And yet, Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming a brutal war of politics into a moral reckoning for the ages. He preserved the Union through 4 years of the bloodiest conflict this continent had ever witnessed. He spoke 272 words at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, that quietly, permanently redefined what this nation was meant to be. And he paid for all of it. With his life, he has been called the Great Emancipator, the preserver of the Republic, the martyr president. But beneath all those monuments, beneath all the speeches carved in stone and the portraits hung in grand halls, there was simply a man, a tired, deeply melancholy man who carried the weight of a collapsing country in the hollows of his eyes. And so tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, we must sit with a question that no monument has ever truly answered. What is the true cost of holding a collapsing house together? Is it measured only in the blood of battlefields, in the 600,000 dead buried in foreign soil? Or is the real cost something quieter, something far more intimate than any battle map can show? The silent, rapid aging of a single man's soul, the deep gray that crept across his face with every dispatch from the front, the sleepless nights, the hollow, faraway stare, the grief too vast and too personal for any cold marble to ever hold. There are no easy answers, but perhaps in the long and quiet hours of the night, we may begin to understand. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep Stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day. The earth in Kentucky in the year 1809 was not soft. It did not welcome a child. It was frozen in winter and cracked in summer, and the men and women who lived upon it did so by force of will alone, by the stubborn insistence of the human body against cold, against hunger, against the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness. It was into this world that a boy was born on the 12th of February, 1809. In a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, a cabin with a dirt floor, a single window cut roughly into the logs, and a stone hearth that gave more smoke than warmth. A child entered the world who had no particular reason to believe he would survive his first winter. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and carpenter of modest means. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a woman of quiet intelligence whose education had come entirely from the long evenings of frontier life in the borrowed pages of a well-worn Bible. They named the boy Abraham Dot. The cabin at Sinking Spring Farm was not a home of comfort. It was a shelter against the cold. Nothing more. The logs were rough-hewn. The floor was packed earth. Outside, the forest pressed in from every direction, dense, ancient, and utterly unmoved by the small human lives conducted at its edge. Lincoln would remember the sounds of that world, the creak of timber in the cold, the wind moving high through the canopy of oak and hickory, the silence that settled after heavy snowfall, a silence so complete, so total, that a boy could feel the whole weight of the continent pressing down upon him. That silence became a kind of companion, a companion that asked nothing, offered nothing, but was always there. When Abraham was 2, the family moved. Thomas Lincoln had lost the title to the Sinking Spring land in a legal dispute, one of the grinding frustrations of frontier life where ownership was contested and impermanent. They relocated to a farm on Knob Creek, still in Kentucky, still within the shadow of those vast and indifferent trees. It was at Knob Creek that Abraham first attended school. Briefly, in a log schoolhouse the settlers called a blab school, where children recited their lessons aloud all at once in a continuous murmur. He attended for only weeks at a time. Education in that place was not a right. It was a stolen luxury taken between the demands of planting and harvest. He learned to read. He learned to write, forming his letters with a stick drawn through the dirt, with a piece of charcoal on the flat of a wooden shovel, with whatever instrument the world placed in his hands. He learned to love words, not yet to shape them into something enduring, but to feel their weight, their texture, the way a single sentence could hold more truth than a week of living. He was 7 years old. And then the world shifted beneath him again. Thomas Lincoln, once more displaced, loaded his family onto a raft and crossed the broad Ohio River into Indiana. The year was 1816. Indiana had entered the Union as a free state, and that distinction would eventually matter enormously, though perhaps not yet to a 7-year-old boy clinging to the rough timber of a flatboat as the cold river moved beneath him. Indiana in winter was a different kind of silence. The trees were thicker here, the land more demanding of the axe and the saw. Thomas Lincoln built a half-faced camp for the family's first weeks, a 3-sided shelter of stacked logs, open to the south, with a fire burning at the open face against the cold. 3 walls, a roof of bark, the snow gathering on the ground outside. Abraham Lincoln was 7 years old, and this was his home. He grew quickly, tall for his age, then taller, then remarkable in his height. He learned the weight of an axe before he was 10. He learned to swing it from the shoulder, to read the grain of a tree, to pace his labor so the body would endure until evening. He worked through every season because there was no other option. The frontier did not accommodate idleness, but what came next was something new. Frontier endurance could prepare a boy to face Dot in the autumn of 1818. Nancy Hanks Lincoln fell gravely ill, what the settlers called milk sickness, a poisoning from cattle that had grazed on white snakeroot. moved through the Little Pigeon Creek community with quiet devastation. Nancy Lincoln was among those it took. She grew weak over days, and then, in October of 1818, she was gone. She was 34 years old. Abraham Lincoln was 9. There are things a child that age does not yet have words for. He would not have had words for the particular quality of absence that settled into the cabin. The way the same rooms, the same low ceiling, felt entirely different from one moment to the next. His father grieved in the manner of frontier men, with continued labor and forward motion. His sister Sarah, 2 years his elder, took on what domestic work she could manage. Thomas Lincoln returned the following year with a new wife. Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own, arrived at the Indiana cabin to find it in disarray. She set about improving it with practical energy and steady care. She was warm. She was organized. And she saw something in young Abraham, a restlessness of mind, a hunger she could not precisely name. She encouraged it. She brought books with her. He devoured them. The Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, A History of the United States, the King James Bible, read and reread until its cadences became the rhythms of his own interior voice. He would walk miles through field and forest to borrow a single volume from a neighbor, returning days later with his mind quietly altered. He read by firelight. He read by the glow of burning wood shavings when there was no candle. He scratched out sentences on a wooden board with charcoal, erased them with a plane when the surface was full, and began again. His formal schooling, taken altogether, amounted to perhaps 1 year of classroom instruction across his entire childhood, scattered across brief sessions in frontier log schools where the teachers themselves were barely educated, where the curriculum extended no further than reading, writing, and basic sums. 1 year. For a man who would one day write the words that a nation would carry into its future, it was enough. Because what he was building in those stolen hours was not a formal education. It was something stranger and more durable. He was building a mind that had taught itself to think. He grew into a young man of extraordinary physical power, 6 feet and 4 inches in height, with arms corded from years of splitting rails and clearing land. He was known in the county as a wrestler of uncommon strength, and as a storyteller who could make men around a fire laugh until their ribs ached, then turn suddenly quiet, holding the room on a single, carefully chosen sentence. He was learning that words were a kind of power. In the spring of 1831, Abraham Lincoln, now 22 years old, lean and strong and restless for a larger world than Indiana could offer, made a flatboat journey down the Sangamon River, then the Illinois, then the great Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans. He had made a similar journey once before, but what he witnessed in New Orleans on this passage would not leave him. The slave markets. He stood in the open squares of that city and watched human beings, men, women, children, inspected, handled, and sold. The transactions conducted with the same ordinary commerce one might see at a livestock auction. He watched the faces of those being sold, and something moved in him that was not yet politics, not yet constitutional argument. It was simpler than all of that, a revulsion deep and physical at what human beings were capable of doing to one another in the full and passive light of an ordinary afternoon. He was 22 years old. He had grown up hearing the language of freedom, the declarations, the founding promises, the stirring words inscribed at the nation's beginning. And now he had seen, with his own eyes, what that language existed alongside. The contradiction did not resolve itself that afternoon beside the river. It would not resolve for decades. And when it finally did, it would resolve at an almost unimaginable cost. But the seed of a reckoning was planted in a young man standing very still in the noise of the market, watching and trying to find the words for what he was looking at. How does a boy raised in the crushing silence of the wilderness find the words to move a nation? One asks this question as if the answer might be simple, as if there is a single moment of illumination that accounts for everything that followed. But the wilderness does not produce simple men. It produces men who have been alone with their thoughts long enough that the thoughts become enormous, layered, and insistent. It produces men who have read the same 3 books so many times that the cadences have entered the bloodstream. Men who have driven an axe through 10,000 mornings of frozen wood and learned, through nothing but the long repetition of difficult labor, that nothing of genuine value arrives without the full weight of effort placed behind it. Can a mind forge itself from nothing but axe swings and stolen moments of reading? The answer, standing in the long shadow of what this young man would eventually become, seems to be yes. A quiet, painful yes. A yes purchased at the cost of a mother's grave in Indiana soil, of winters endured in a half-open shelter, of years of labor in the cold and the dark. A yes that cost everything it was worth, but yes, the frontier had been his crucible, and from it, slowly, something had been made. The year is 1831, and Abraham Lincoln arrives in the small settlement of New Salem, Illinois, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a borrowed education assembled from fragments. The village sits on a bluff above the Sangamon River, a collection of perhaps 100 souls, log structures, a mill, and the quiet promise of becoming something more. He is 22 years old, lanky, awkward, his hands still rough from splitting rails and poling flatboats. He takes work as a clerk in Denton Offutt's general store, measuring out flour and sugar, listening to the rhythm of frontier conversation. The men of New Salem gather around the stove on cold evenings, and it is here that Lincoln discovers his gift, the ability to hold a room with a story. He recounts tales from his flatboat journeys, mimics the accents of river captains, shapes tragedy and comedy with his voice until grown men are doubled over with laughter or leaning forward in rapt silence. This is not performance, it is connection, a way of earning respect without inheritance or formal schooling. When Offutt's store collapses into bankruptcy, Lincoln drifts, working as a surveyor, as a postmaster, odd jobs that keep him fed but do not satisfy the hunger in his mind. He borrows a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England from a traveling lawyer, and once again, by candlelight and firelight, he begins to teach himself, this time the intricate architecture of the law. The path to becoming a lawyer in Illinois requires no formal degree, only a certificate of good moral character and demonstrated knowledge. Lincoln studies while lying beneath a tree, studies while walking survey lines, commits statutes and precedents to memory with the same fierce discipline that once drove him through Shakespeare and Euclid. In 1836, at the age of 27, he is licensed to practice law. He moves to Springfield, the new state capital, and enters into partnership with John Todd Stewart, a prominent attorney. The courtroom becomes his theater, and he brings to it the same storytelling instinct that captivated audiences in New Salem. He argues cases with a peculiar blend of folksy humor and razor-sharp logic, disarming juries with self-deprecating jokes before dismantling opposing arguments with surgical precision. It is in Springfield that he meets Mary Ann Todd, a woman from a wealthy Kentucky family, educated, sharp-tongued, ambitious. She is everything Lincoln is not: polished, connected, versed in the social graces of high society. Their courtship is turbulent, marked by broken engagements and long silences. Lincoln struggles with what he later calls the hypo, periods of deep melancholy that leave him paralyzed with doubt. He writes letters questioning whether he is capable of making any woman happy, whether his ambitions are delusions. But Mary sees something in him that others miss, a greatness waiting to unfold, a mind that refuses to settle. On the 4th of November, 1842, they marry in the parlor of her sister's home. The union is one of stark contrasts. Her Kentucky aristocracy against his frontier roughness, her social aspirations against his brooding solitude. They move into a small rented room above the Globe Tavern, $8 a week, the walls thin enough to hear every creak and conversation from neighboring rooms. Their first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, is born in 1843, and the weight of fatherhood settles onto Lincoln's shoulders like an unfamiliar coat. But greater tragedy follows. Their second son, Edward Baker Lincoln, born in 1846, dies just before his 4th birthday in 1850, likely from tuberculosis. The loss shatters Mary, sends her spiraling into grief so profound that neighbors hear her wails through closed windows. Lincoln, too, is devastated, but he grieves inward silently, retreating into work as a mechanism of survival. 2 more sons follow: William Wallace Lincoln in 1850 and Thomas Tad Lincoln in 1853. The house on 8th and Jackson in Springfield fills with the chaos of childhood, but the shadow of Eddie's death never fully lifts. Lincoln's law practice expands beyond Springfield, and he begins riding the vast 8th Judicial Circuit of Illinois, a territory covering over 11,000 square miles. Twice a year, in spring and fall, he travels with a rotating cast of lawyers and a single presiding judge, moving from county seat to county seat. Bloomington, Danville, Urbana, Clinton, Metamora. The circuit is grueling. Weeks away from home, sleeping in crowded tavern rooms, enduring dust and mud and endless miles on horseback or cramped stagecoaches. But for Lincoln, it is an education in human nature. He sees the raw, unfiltered heartbeat of frontier America: land disputes, debt collections, assault cases, contested wills. He defends clients who cannot pay him, writes letters for illiterate farmers, listens to widows and squatters and merchants, absorbing the textures of their lives. The other lawyers notice his peculiar habits: how he reads newspapers aloud by firelight, how he lies on his back on courtroom floors during recesses, how he refuses to take cases he believes are unjust, even when they would bring good fees. He becomes known not just as a skillful advocate, but as a man of deep, unshakable integrity. His reputation spreads slowly, steadily, rooted not in theatrics, but in the quiet accumulation of trust. Lincoln's entry into politics is almost accidental. driven less by ambition than by a sense of moral obligation. He serves 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature as a Whig, supporting internal improvements, infrastructure, public education. In 1846, he is elected to the United States House of Representatives, the only term he will serve in Congress before the presidency. He arrives in Washington with his family, rents a boarding house room, and immediately finds himself out of step with the prevailing political winds. The Mexican-American War is raging, and President James K. Polk insists the conflict began when Mexican forces attacked American troops on American soil. Lincoln introduces his spot resolutions, demanding to know the exact spot where American blood was shed, challenging the legitimacy of the war's justification. The move is politically disastrous. He is mocked as unpatriotic, and his Illinois constituents turn against him. He also votes repeatedly for the Wilmot Proviso, which would ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. The vote is symbolic. The proviso never passes, but it marks the beginning of Lincoln's public stance against the expansion of slavery. He does not yet call for abolition in the states where it exists, but he is adamant that it must not spread into new territories. This is the moral line he will not cross, the principle that will define the rest of his political life. His single term in Congress ends in 1849, and he returns to Springfield, believing his political career is finished. He throws himself back into his law practice, takes cases all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court, becomes one of the most sought-after attorneys in the state. But the question of slavery continues to gnaw at him. A slow poison in the nation's bloodstream is political compromise, a necessary virtue. Or is it a slow poison that merely delays the inevitable reckoning of a nation's conscience? Lincoln watches as the Compromise of 1850 temporarily eases tensions, allowing California to enter as a free state while strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act, which forces Northern citizens to participate in the capture and return of escaped slaves. He sees neighbors and clients torn between obedience to federal law and the moral revulsion of hunting human beings. He hears the arguments that compromise preserves the Union, that gradual change is safer than rupture, that politics is the art of the possible, that radical action would shatter the fragile republic into 1,000 pieces. The voices of moderation are everywhere, urging patience, urging caution, urging faith that time itself will erode the institution of slavery without bloodshed. And yet he cannot shake the image seared into his memory from his youth. The slave market in New Orleans, the auction block, the chains, the eyes of men and women, being appraised like livestock. Can a nation built on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal continue to treat some men as property without becoming a lie unto itself? Can a house divided against itself stand, or must it eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradiction? He does not yet have the answers, but the questions have begun to harden into convictions like iron cooling in a forge. Every compromise feels like another postponement, another generation of human beings sacrificed on the altar of political expediency. He thinks of his son Eddie's small grave, of Mary's inconsolable grief, and wonders how many mothers in chains have buried children torn from them and sold away. The young rail splitter who once borrowed books by candlelight has become a prairie lawyer who understands the law's power and its limits. He has learned that justice is not always found in courtrooms, that some truths cannot be litigated away, that some moral debts cannot be settled with legal briefs and procedural motions. The stage is being set, though he does not yet know it, for a return to politics that will consume the rest of his life, his health, his peace, and ultimately his very existence. It was the spring of 1854 when the first cracks became fissures, and the fissures became canyons. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, a legislative compromise born of political expediency, tore through the fragile peace like a lightning bolt through dry timber. Senator Stephen Douglas, ambitious and calculating, had championed a doctrine of popular sovereignty, allowing new territories to decide for themselves whether to embrace or reject the institution of slavery. To Abraham Lincoln, now 45 years old, and settled into the comfortable rhythm of his Springfield law practice, this was not compromise. It was betrayal. It was the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, the sacred compact that had held the nation's sectional rage at bay for over 3 decades. He had watched from the sidelines, through those years of rail-splitting and legal briefs, as politicians danced around the central moral question. But this was different. This was an invitation to spread the cancer of human bondage into lands that had been promised to freedom. Something ignited in him, a slow-burning fury that he had suppressed for too long. The quiet lawyer began to speak again, not in courtrooms, but in town squares and public halls. His voice, that high-pitched prairie drawl, carried a new weight, a moral clarity that cut through the fog of political rhetoric. He spoke in Peoria, Illinois, for 3 full hours, dissecting the act with surgical precision, laying bare its moral bankruptcy. He did not shout. He did not wave his arms dramatically. He simply spoke the truth, word by measured word, until the audience sat in stunned silence. The Republican Party was being born in these moments, forged in the fire of anti-slavery conviction, and Abraham Lincoln was finding his place within it. The years that followed were a strange dance between destiny and doubt. He ran for the Senate in 1858, not as a safe bet, but as a long-shot candidate challenging the very architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Stephen Douglas, the little giant, a man of immense political power and oratorical skill. The Illinois Republican Convention nominated Lincoln, and he stood before them to deliver an acceptance speech that would echo through history. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he declared, his voice steady and somber. "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." The room fell silent. Even his supporters felt a chill. This was not the language of careful political maneuvering. This was prophecy, and it was terrifying. His advisers begged him to soften the words, to add qualifications, to leave room for compromise. He refused. He knew what he had done. He had spoken an unpopular truth, one that acknowledged the inevitable, that the nation must choose, fully and finally, between freedom and bondage. There would be no more half measures, no more decades of delay. The speech was printed, distributed, and debated. Some called it radical. Others called it suicide. Lincoln simply waited. The debates themselves became the battleground. 7 times across Illinois, in the blazing heat of summer and the cooling winds of autumn, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas stood before thousands of spectators. transforming what should have been a local Senate race into a national philosophical reckoning. Ottawa, Freeport, Jonesboro, Charleston, Galesburg, Quincy, Alton, each town became a stage for the fundamental questions of the age. Douglas was polished, confident, dismissive. He mocked Lincoln's appearance, his awkward height, his ungainly movements. He argued for popular sovereignty, for letting each territory decide its own fate, painting himself as the champion of democracy and local control. But Lincoln, gaunt and ungainly, stood his ground. He spoke slowly, deliberately, forcing Douglas into impossible corners. At Freeport, he posed a question that would haunt Douglas for the rest of his career. Could the people of a territory lawfully exclude slavery before statehood? Douglas answered yes, preserving his Illinois support but destroying his standing in the South. Lincoln lost the Senate race. The state legislature, still controlled by holdover Democrats, chose Douglas. But something far more profound had happened. The debates had been published in newspapers across the nation. People read Lincoln's words, absorbed his logic, felt the moral weight of his arguments. A defeated Senate candidate had become a national figure. The little giant had won the battle, but the tall, melancholy lawyer from Springfield had won something far more valuable. He had won the attention of a nation on the brink. When can a man step forward to speak an unpopular truth and not seek power, but simply accept the terrible gravity of fate pressing down upon his shoulders? Lincoln did not campaign for the presidency. He did not tour the country, shaking hands and making promises. He waited in Springfield, splitting firewood, meeting with visitors, writing careful letters. But the words he had spoken, the positions he had staked out, had created their own momentum. The Republican National Convention gathered in Chicago in May of 1860 in a massive wooden structure called the Wigwam, built specifically for this purpose. The favorite was William Seward of New York, a polished statesman with years of experience and powerful backers. Lincoln was considered a regional curiosity, a dark horse at best. But his managers worked the crowds, made promises, distributed tickets to Lincoln supporters until the wigwam was packed with friendly voices. On the third ballot, as the tension reached a breaking point, the delegations began to shift. Indiana fell to Lincoln, then Pennsylvania, then Ohio. The wigwam erupted in deafening roars. Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter, the country lawyer, the man who had lost more elections than he had won, was now the Republican nominee for President of the United States. When the news reached Springfield by telegraph, Lincoln was playing handball behind a building. Someone ran to tell him. He stood there, dirty and sweating, and simply said, "I must go home now. There is a lady there who will want to hear this news." He walked home through the dusty streets, knowing that his life and the life of the nation had just changed irrevocably. Can a nation built on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal survive while forcing millions to wear chains? This was not an abstract philosophical question for Abraham Lincoln. It was the central burning question of his entire political existence. He had seen the slave markets of New Orleans as a young man. He had argued cases for fugitive slaves. He had watched the compromise of 1854's Northern citizens to become slave catchers. He had studied the Constitution, that imperfect document that had tried to balance freedom and bondage, and he knew its fatal flaw. The founders had planted the seeds of liberty, but had allowed the roots of slavery to remain, hoping time would solve what they could not. But time had only deepened the crisis. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, the violence in bleeding Kansas. Each event pushed the nation closer to the edge. Lincoln did not believe in immediate abolition. He was not John Brown, ready to raid armories and start slave revolts. But he believed with every fiber of his being that slavery must not spread, that it must be placed, as he said, in the course of ultimate extinction. He believed that the American experiment, this fragile democracy built on the consent of the governed, could not endure if it continued to betray its own founding principles. And now, in 1860, as he stood on the threshold of the presidency, he knew that the time for delay had ended. The nation had reached the moment of choice. Would it tear itself apart, or would it finally confront the truth it had been avoiding since 1776? He did not know, but he knew with a quiet, terrible certainty that he would be the one standing at the center of that storm. The debates were over. The speeches were done. The votes had been cast. Now came the reckoning. The weeks following the election were not triumphant ones. They were heavy, measured, and cold. The celebrations in Springfield faded as telegraphs began to arrive, one dispatch after another, each carrying the weight of a crumbling republic. South Carolina was first. On the 20th of December, 1860, she voted to sever herself from the Union, her representatives signing an ordinance of secession with the ceremonial gravity of men who believed they were founding something new rather than destroying something old. Mississippi followed, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. By the 1st of February, 1861, 7 states had declared themselves a separate nation. They called it the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president, raised their own flag over captured federal properties, and waited with the quiet certainty of people who did not believe the North would actually fight. Abraham Lincoln stood in Springfield and read these dispatches with a face that gave away very little. Those who watched him closely said his gray eyes seemed to deepen, as though the light behind them were being slowly replaced by something heavier. He was 51 years old. The dark hair was showing silver at the temples. He had not yet grown the beard that would define every future image of him, though a young girl named Grace Bedell had already written to suggest it might soften his angular face. He would grow it soon on the journey east. He was changing in more ways than one, and the nation was changing faster than any single man could slow. The journey to Washington had been designed as a 12-day celebration through the northern states. He gave speeches from the backs of train cars. He shook thousands of hands. He told his long, wandering stories, those tales that made crowds laugh even when the subject was not strictly funny, because the telling was itself a form of communion. For brief, frozen moments in those February afternoons, standing on the rear platform with bare winter fields spreading away in every direction, it was possible to imagine that nothing catastrophic was imminent. But in Baltimore, a conspiracy had taken shape. Alan Pinkerton, the Scottish-born detective who had built the first private intelligence network in the country, uncovered a plot to assassinate the president-elect as his train passed through the city. The plan was specific. The threat was credible, and it forced a decision Lincoln accepted reluctantly, understanding precisely what it would look like. He would abandon the public schedule. He would travel in secret. On the night of the 22nd February, 1861, Abraham Lincoln boarded a train in Philadelphia in deep darkness. He wore a soft felt hat instead of the tall stovepipe that made him instantly recognizable, and a shawl across his long frame. He traveled with only Pinkerton and one companion, Ward Hill Lamon, through the cold, still night and into the gray dawn of the nation's capital. He arrived at 6 in the morning. No crowd waited. A congressman he knew shook his hand on the platform. That was all. He had come to the city the way a man comes to a reckoning, quietly, with his eyes open. The Confederate gun batteries in Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter at 4:30 in the morning on the 12th of April, 1861. The garrison inside was small, commanded by Major Robert Anderson, a Kentuckian caught between loyalties that the war itself embodied. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. Anderson surrendered. The meaning of those hours was not contained in the casualties. It was contained in what they announced to the watching world. The war had begun. Not a political confrontation that words might still resolve. A real war with all the irreversible weight that word carries when spoken aloud for the first time. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, promptly left the Union in response, unwilling to send their sons against their Southern neighbors. The Confederacy spread across an enormous portion of the continent, and the United States found itself with sudden and absolute clarity. At war with itself, the early battles were a cascade of disasters at Bull Run in Virginia. On the 21st of July, 1861, the Union Army was routed so completely that civilians who had driven from Washington in carriages to watch what they expected to be a swift Northern victory were swept up in the panicked retreat of fleeing soldiers, congressmen, reporters, ladies with picnic lunches, all of them running toward the Capitol in the summer dust, suddenly understanding that this war would not end in 90 days. Lincoln received the news in the War Department. He lay awake through that night on a sofa in his office, receiving dispatches and visitors in the small hours while the broken army reassembled on the muddy roads south of the city, appointed George B. McClellan to command the Army of the Potomac, and invested considerable hope in the young general's organizational talent and his pronounced self-confidence. McClellan built a magnificent army and trained it beautifully, and the men loved him for it. And then he would not use it. He overestimated Confederate strength enormously. He canceled offensives. He requested more men and more time. Lincoln waited with the patience of a man who understood patience as strategy, and then with the steady impatience of a man watching a war lengthen while a great army sat idle in its caps. He said once, quietly, that if McClellan was not going to use the army, he would very much like to borrow it himself for a while. The generals who followed varied only in how they failed. John Pope was routed at Second Bull Run in the late summer of 1862. Ambrose Burnside ordered charge after hopeless charge at Fredericksburg in December of that year, sending successive waves of soldiers across open ground toward Confederate positions entrenched on the heights above the town. Bodies lay thick on the frozen slopes of Marye's Heights when the battle was done. Lincoln, upon receiving the complete casualty figures, was reported to have paced his office for hours. He said to a visitor, without theatrical embellishment, that if there was a place in existence worse than hell, he was in it. He spent long, irregular hours in the telegraph office of the War Department. He would walk across the White House lawn at nearly any hour, enter the low building where the operators worked through the night, and pull a chair beside a desk to read the incoming dispatches as they arrived in the steady amber light of gas lamps. He sat for 2 or 3 hours without speaking, absorbing each report, translating the clipped language of military telegrams into the reality of human lives ended on fields far from the families who would receive the news days, later by letter or by rumor. The men who worked in that room said that on the worst nights, Lincoln arrived looking tired and left looking old, as though hours had accomplished in that quiet, lamp-lit space what ordinarily requires years, and here, in the silence between those dispatches, we must pause. We must hold the question that no monument can answer and no ceremonial occasion has ever addressed with full honesty. What does it mean to carry 100,000 lives inside a single human mind? We speak of leadership in broad, dignified terms that sometimes obscure what it actually requires of the person bearing it. Lincoln's son Willie died in the White House in February of 1862, 11 years old, of typhoid fever. His father sat with the body for a long time after the physicians left. He wept. He went on working the following morning because the dispatches kept arriving and the war did not pause for any man's grief. He carried both things simultaneously, the private wound and the public weight, pressing forward into both. The photographs taken of him during these years hold evidence that words only partially convey. He came to the White House lean and vigorous at 51, a man who had split rails and walked enormous distances without complaint. Within 2 years, he looked like a man of 70. The lines in his face did not deepen gradually in the slow, ordinary work of time. They carved themselves almost overnight, with each defeat and each casualty list and each night in the telegraph office and each morning when he rose and simply began again. His eyes in those later wartime photographs carry an expression that resists easy description. It is not despair, not resignation, something steadier and heavier than either. The expression of a man who has looked clearly at the full arithmetic of what he has chosen and decided to pay the cost regardless, because the alternative is something he cannot bring himself to become. How does a leader sleep when every dispatch brings the cries of the dying? Perhaps the honest answer is that sometimes he does not sleep at all. Perhaps the true measure of such a man is not that the weight left him unaffected, but that he carried it forward into each new morning regardless, into the cold light of another day that would ask everything of him, and then a little more. The war was not over. The worst of it was not yet behind him. But he had not turned away, and he had not chosen the easier path of a negotiated settlement that left the original wound open and the original wrong intact. He had walked directly into the fire with full knowledge of what that choice would cost a man, and he intended to keep walking. The question that remained unanswered in those long, exhausted nights of 1862 and 1863 was whether the nation could endure long enough and hold together firmly enough to walk out of the fire beside him. The morning of September 17th, 1862, came quietly at first. A gray mist settled low across the cornfields and the gentle, curving banks of Antietam Creek in western Maryland. Then, before the sun had fully climbed, the fields became something else entirely. General George McClellan commanded the Army of the Potomac that day. He had roughly 87,000 men, and intelligence told him that General Robert E. Lee's Confederate force numbered considerably fewer. He had every advantage a careful general could ask for. And yet, McClellan moved with the same hesitant rhythm that had frustrated Lincoln for months. He held back his reserves. He attacked in pieces rather than in the coordinated, overwhelming wave the moment demanded. The cornfields of the Miller farm were consumed in less than 4 hours. Men fell in rows, as though the corn itself were being harvested by something terrible and invisible. The sunken road that came to be called Bloody Lane received its name that morning, carved into the record by the bodies of Confederate soldiers who held the position so long the lane itself filled with the dead. By evening, approximately 23,000 men on both sides had been killed, wounded, or were simply gone. 20-3,000 in a single day. Lincoln received the reports in Washington. He read the numbers in the telegraph dispatches with that stillness those around him had learned to recognize. Not the stillness of indifference, but the stillness of a man absorbing an almost unbearable weight and choosing not to let it show. McClellan declared the result a Union victory, and then sat still. He did not pursue Lee's withdrawing army. The Army of the Potomac rested while Lee reorganized across the Potomac River, and the war stretched on. But Lincoln took what the battle had given him. It was not the clean, decisive victory he had hoped for. It was a stalemate wrapped in blood and gray smoke. And yet it was enough. He had been carrying something inside himself for months, held quietly, waiting for the ground beneath the nation to be solid, enough to carry its weight. He had begun drafting the document the previous summer. Since July of 1862, the proclamation had existed in preliminary form, shared first with his cabinet, where Secretary of State William Seward had counseled patience. Issue it after a victory, Seward had said, or the world will read it as the act of a failing government. So Lincoln had waited. Through the defeat at Second Bull Run, through the maddening stillness of McClellan, through nights without sleep, he had kept the draft quiet inside himself. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after Antietam, he gathered his cabinet once more. This time he did not ask for their opinions. He read them a short passage from a humorous book, something by Artemus Ward, and the cabinet watched in quiet bewilderment. Then he set the book aside, and his voice changed entirely. He told them he had made a promise to himself and to his God. If the Confederate army were driven back from Maryland, he would take it as a sign. Antietam had been that sign. He was not requesting their counsel. He was informing them that he would proceed. The fundamental decision had already been made in the long silences of the preceding months. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued that day. It declared that on the 1st of January, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States would be declared, from that moment forward, and forever free. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln stood in the White House receiving room and shook hands for nearly 3 hours at the formal New Year's reception. When he sat down to sign the final proclamation, his right hand trembled from the exertion, and he paused. He said aloud that if his hand appeared unsteady, future generations might believe he had harbored some doubt. He had harbored none. He straightened himself and signed his full name. Abraham Lincoln. Deliberate and clear. The war had changed. It was no longer a contest over secession, over tariffs, over the legal question of withdrawal from the Union. It was now, officially and irrevocably, a war about human freedom. Lincoln had transformed a political conflict into a moral cause, making it nearly impossible for European powers sympathetic to the Confederacy to intervene without, standing openly on the side of slavery. And then the men came, African American men, free and formerly enslaved, began enlisting in the Union Army through 1863 in numbers that grew with each passing month. The formal organization of the United States Colored Troops began in May of that year, and by the war's end, approximately 180,000 would serve in the Union ranks. They came under stark inequality. They were paid less than white soldiers for much of the war. They were warned that if captured, they would not be treated as prisoners of war, but returned to bondage or executed. They came anyway. At Port Hudson in Louisiana in May of 1863. African American regiments charged Confederate fortifications with a ferocity that silenced those who had claimed they would not fight. At Milliken's Bend on the Mississippi in June, outnumbered African American troops held their position in brutal, close combat. Then, in July, the 54th Massachusetts infantry led the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The charge of the 54th Massachusetts was witnessed by press correspondents. Their colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, led from the front and was killed. Roughly half the regiment became casualties. They did not take the fort, but the image of those men advancing into withering fire, fully aware of what capture meant for them, moved through the nation with a moral weight that no political document could have achieved alone. Lincoln read the accounts carefully. These men were not fighting only for the Union. They were fighting to make the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation real. They were fighting for the thing itself. In July of 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg stretched across 3 terrible days in southern Pennsylvania. When it ended, Lee's second attempt to carry the war into the North had failed at a cost his army could not recover from. The fields around the small town, among the peach orchards and rocky outcroppings of Little Round Top, and the sunken lanes of the wheat field, held the bodies of more than 7,000 dead. That November, the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg was formally dedicated. Lincoln had been invited as something of an afterthought to offer a few appropriate remarks. The principal address would be delivered by Edward Everett, a celebrated orator who spoke for 2 full hours. Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg on the evening of November 18th, having drafted the address in Washington. The quiet hours of the journey gave him time to refine the words. The ceremony on November 19th was cold and gray. Everett's voice filled the November air for the full length of his oration. And then Lincoln stood. He wore a black suit and a black crepe mourning band around his stovepipe hat, still grieving his son Willie. He put on his spectacles. He unfolded the page. He spoke for approximately 2 minutes, 272 words, and here the author must simply pause and stay with what those 2 minutes meant. Edward Everett wrote to Lincoln the following day. He told him that Lincoln had accomplished in 2 minutes what? Everett himself had failed to accomplish in 2 hours, but the question presses deeper than a gracious compliment. Words cannot raise the dead. The 7,000 buried in those Pennsylvania fields, the 23,000 fallen at Antietam, the hundreds of thousands still to die before the war closed. No syllable, however precisely chosen, could restore a single one of them. No sentence could give back a brother, a father, a son. And yet Lincoln stood on that ground and did something that political oratory almost never does. He did not speak of victory. He did not reach for the familiar language of a leader reassuring his people. He said, quietly and with devastating precision, that the brave men who struggled there had consecrated that ground far beyond any power of words to add or detract. He admitted, standing directly above the graves, that language itself was insufficient. And in that admission, he somehow made the language more than sufficient. He reached past the Constitution, back to the Declaration of Independence and the proposition that all men are created equal. He reframed the war not as a political dispute settled by arms, but as the nation's ultimate test of whether that proposition could endure, whether a government conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality could persist against the forces. Determined to unmake it, he turned to the living. He told the survivors, the soldiers still in the field, and the families waiting at home, that it was for them to dedicate themselves to the unfinished work, that the dead should not have died in vain, that the nation should have a new birth of freedom. The applause was polite and brief. Some newspapers dismissed the address. The words seemed too plain, too short, too quiet for such an occasion. And yet history has a patient and careful memory. What it remembers of Gettysburg is not the 2 hours. It is the 2 minutes. The quiet voice of a tired 54-year-old man in a black mourning band, standing above the graves, who had the courage to say aloud that the experiment was not finished, that the work remained, that the living still carried a debt to the dead that no ceremony could discharge. Words cannot raise the dead, but they can, it seems, consecrate the living. The final year of the war arrives like an executioner's slow march. It is January 1864, and Abraham Lincoln stands at the threshold of the nation's darkest hour. The casualty lists have grown so long that they blur into abstraction, ink stains on paper that can never capture the screams of the wounded or the silence of the dead. He has burned through general after general, watching them fail, watching them retreat, watching them drown in their own caution. The war grinds on, a massive, unstoppable engine of destruction that consumes sons and fathers with industrial efficiency. But now, in the cold breath of a new year, he makes a decision that will reshape everything. He summons Ulysses S. Grant, the rough, quiet, relentless commander who took Vicksburg and broke the Confederate spine in the West. In March 1864, Lincoln pins the 3 stars of lieutenant general onto Grant's uniform, the first man to hold that rank since George Washington. Grant does not promise quick victory. He promises only one thing, that he will fight. And fight he does. The Overland Campaign begins in May, a horrifying, grinding series of battles through the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. The casualties are staggering, biblical in scale. 55,000 Union soldiers fall in 6 weeks. The newspapers scream for Grant's removal, calling him a butcher. But Lincoln does not flinch. He sees in Grant something he has never seen before, a man who will not quit, who will not retreat, who understands that this war can only end one way. Lincoln himself is withering. His face is a geography of sleepless nights, deep trenches carved by grief and responsibility. His son Willie has been dead for 2 years, but the ache never leaves. Mary Todd descends further into her own private madness, hosting seances in the White House trying to speak to the ghost of their boy. Lincoln bears it all in silence, walking the halls late at night, reading casualty reports by candlelight, his shoulders bowed under a weight no man should carry alone. The autumn of 1864 brings the presidential election, a brutal test of democracy in wartime. The Democrats nominate George McClellan, the very general Lincoln fired for his timidity, running on a platform of peace and negotiation with the Confederacy. It is a referendum on Lincoln himself, on his emancipation policy, on whether the war is worth the blood price. For weeks, Lincoln believes he will lose. He prepares a sealed memorandum instructing his cabinet to cooperate with the incoming president to save the Union before the inauguration, because it will be impossible afterward. But then Sherman takes Atlanta in September. The tide turns. Lincoln wins the election decisively, carrying every state that remains in the Union except 3. The people have spoken. The war will continue until it is finished. On March 4, 1865, Abraham Lincoln stands on the steps of the Capitol for his second inaugural address. The weather is gray, wet, fitting for the somberness of the moment. He does not gloat. He does not celebrate. Instead, he delivers what may be the most profound political speech in American history, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. His voice is low, steady, carrying the weight of every grave from Shiloh to Cold Harbor. He speaks of shared guilt, of the sin of slavery infecting both North and South, of a God who may demand payment in blood for every lash of the whip. It is not a speech of triumph. It is a meditation on suffering, on divine justice, on the terrible cost of moral reckoning. The crowd listens in near silence, stunned by the empathy flowing from a man who has every reason to hate. By April 1865, the Confederate Army is collapsing. General Lee's forces are starving, broken, fleeing westward from Petersburg and Richmond. On April 3rd, Union troops march into Richmond, the Confederate capital, and find it burning. The retreating rebels have set their own city ablaze, destroying arsenals and warehouses to deny them to the invaders. The next day, Abraham Lincoln does something almost incomprehensible. He boards a small boat and travels up the James River to Richmond. He walks through the smoldering streets of the enemy capital with only a handful of sailors and his young son, Tad. There is no grand procession, no military escort, just a tall, gaunt man in a black suit stepping through the ruins. Freed slaves recognize him first. They fall to their knees, weeping, reaching out to touch the hem of his coat. He tells them gently, "Do not kneel to me. You must kneel only to God." He walks to the Confederate White House, sits in Jefferson Davis's chair, and asks for a glass of water. It is a moment of quiet, devastating symbolism. The man who preserved the Union sits calmly in the seat of rebellion, offering no retribution, only the promise of peace. On April 9th, 1865, at a small crossroads village called Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant. The terms are generous, astonishingly so. Officers may keep their sidearms. Men who own horses may take them home for the spring planting. No one will be prosecuted for treason. Grant later says he followed Lincoln's wishes. Let them down easy. The war, for all practical purposes, is over. 4 years of unimaginable carnage have claimed 620,000 lives, more American dead than all other wars combined. The nation is exhausted, bleeding, broken, but it is still one nation. Lincoln has achieved what seemed impossible. The Union is preserved. Slavery is abolished. The Republic endures. He allows himself a brief moment of relief, a rare smile. He speaks of rebuilding, of amnesty, of stitching the torn fabric back together. He is 56 years old and looks 70, but he is, for the first time in years, cautiously hopeful. 5 days later, on the evening of April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln attends a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. It is Good Friday. The play is a light comedy, Our American Cousin, a chance to laugh after years of darkness. He sits in the presidential box with Mary, a young Army officer, and his fiancée. The bodyguard assigned to protect him wanders off to a nearby tavern. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, a well-known actor named John Wilkes Booth slips into the box. He carries a small Derringer pistol. He fires a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head, just behind the left ear. The president slumps forward. Booth leaps to the stage, breaking his leg, and disappears into the night, screaming the Virginia state motto, Sic semper tyrannis. Thus always to tyrants. Lincoln is carried across the street to a boarding house owned by a tailor named William Peterson. They lay him diagonally across a bed too small for his long frame. Doctors work through the night, but there is nothing to be done. The bullet has torn through his brain. Mary Todd sobs uncontrollably in the adjoining room. At 7:22 on the morning of April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln takes his final breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at the bedside, speaks the words that will echo through history. Now he belongs to the ages. Why must the peacemaker so often pay the final price for the peace he creates? Lincoln had spent 4 years holding the nation together with nothing but will and words, enduring losses that would have shattered lesser men. He absorbed the hatred of the South and the impatience of the North, the screams of the wounded, and the silence of the dead. He signed his name to orders that sent boys to die by the tens of thousands. He freed 4 million enslaved people with a single stroke of his pen. He redefined what America could mean. And when the guns finally fell silent, when the work was nearly complete, a madman's bullet ended him. Perhaps it is the cruelest irony of history that those who give everything to build a better world are rarely allowed to see it. In death, Abraham Lincoln underwent a transformation he never sought in life. The tired, grieving man who walked the halls of the White House became an eternal monument to freedom, justice, and the terrible cost of moral courage. His face, carved into mountains and printed on currency, became the face of American idealism itself. But the true Lincoln, the one who split rails and rode circuits and wept for his dead son, the one who doubted and struggled and somehow found the strength to continue, that Lincoln is harder to see through the marble and myth. Yet it is that Lincoln, the deeply human one, who teaches us the most profound lesson. Greatness is not the absence of suffering. It is the choice to carry suffering forward, to transform it into something that outlasts the pain. Abraham Lincoln did not save the Union because he was invincible. He saved it because, despite everything, he refused to let it die. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep Stories, Sleep Dream are released here every day.